I'd like to turn your attention this morning to Psalm 11. Psalm 11, and we're going to read the whole psalm, just 7 verses there. But I'd like to focus on sort of an attitude or a perspective issue today, and hopefully be helpful to us. Sometimes, if we're not careful, we can look around us, and it's easy to become pessimistic, and we see this problem and we see that issue, and we're struggling through life. And it seems as though David had a bit of a challenge here, even people around him that had sort of that idea, and all the naysayers and those that were wringing their hands, perhaps, or maybe they were even doing it sort of as almost getting after David a little bit and warning him in a negative sort of way. So let's look at Psalm 11 here today, and beginning with verse number 1. In the Lord put I my trust. How say ye to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? Notice there he's dealing with these naysayers, and they're trying to get him to run away. For lo, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow upon the string, that they may privily shoot at the upright in heart. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? That will be our text this morning. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids try the children of men. The Lord trieth the righteous, but the wicked and him that loveth violence his soul hateth. Upon the wicked he shall rain snares, fire and brimstone, and an horrible tempest. This shall be the portion of their cup. For the righteous Lord loveth righteousness. His countenance doth behold the upright. Concluding there with verse 7, of course, the end of the psalm. That question here this morning is, what can the righteous do? What can the righteous do? Sometimes, again, we look around, we maybe feel a little bit like David, and there's this person with a negative message, and that person's wringing their hands, and we're surrounded with all the negatives, and we sometimes might almost feel like, let's just run away and hide somewhere. Let's just hope that God will come back, or Jesus will come back for his bride, and we'll be able to go to be with him. But I want us to have maybe a little bit different perspective this morning. I want us to kind of get our eyes open to the reality, the contrast really that we see between verse 3 and verse 4. In verse 3, we have the naysayers basically saying, what can we even do? And then David, maybe in a sense, responding, saying, the Lord is in his holy temple. That's what we can do. We can trust in him. And so this morning, if you don't get anything else out of the message, just remember that our perspective ought to always keep him in mind. We might think back to, actually, it's a Christmas song, and this time of the year, I'm a little bit of a Scrooge, I guess, in waiting for Christmas music until after we've spent time in Thanksgiving. But anyway, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, of course, was the famous poet and wrote one of the songs that we sometimes enjoy at Christmas time. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. But if you think about some of what he was going through, and it seems like the time of the writing of that particular song was right there around the Civil War. And maybe the same year the Civil War started, I think, or right close to that. He suffered just intensely right during that time. And his wife, Fanny, caught fire. It was an awful thing, but I think they weren't maybe quite sure exactly if her dress got a little too close to a candle or something, and her dress caught fire, and he tried to save her. He was badly burned and scarred himself. Some wonder if maybe that was even, or it seems as though maybe that was why he grew the beard that we're familiar with to hide the scars. But anyway, he was not able to save his wife. I think she died the next day. Then in the process of all that, then his son, he obviously, is in terrible grief. In fact, it seems as though in some ways he never really maybe fully recovered emotionally from his wife's death. And you can imagine maybe even just the horror of trying to save her and not being successful. But then his son ran off to join the Civil War against his father's wishes. And again, you can probably imagine in his grief and loss with his wife, he probably wanted to keep his family close, but not only his son, but then his three daughters. Somehow, I'm not sure, through nursing or something, they ended up appearing on the field of battle, I think maybe at Gettysburg. But he was certainly a troubled man when he wrote, I heard the bells on Christmas Day. And yet, if you kind of work your way through that song, you see at the beginning, it's almost like verse 3. It's like, well, what can we even do? Everything's gone wrong. Life is a dreary slog to the finish. It's just awful. But then as he kind of begins to get through there, he begins to kind of get to that point, and I heard the bells. I realized God's on his throne. He still knows what's going on. And maybe you and I could take comfort from that fact. Maybe I didn't even encourage you. Again, I'm not necessarily a big fan of Christmas music way early, but that would be one to go back through and just read his progression and how he goes from despondency and discouragement and depression, and he comes to the point where he knows God is still in control. And this morning we want to recognize that, not just verse 3, what can the righteous do? But verse number 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. His throne is in heaven, and he sees what's going on. It mentions about the eyes behold, his eyelids try. We recognize that God knows. Sometimes we do have questions. How can the righteous survive or even flourish, maybe, when the foundations of truth and justice, and we can point fingers at various circumstances and various even court decisions perhaps, and we kind of feel a little depressed at times. There's evil rampant all around us. And when the foundations of our culture have just eroded into shambles, what can the righteous do? How can we even make it? Can we even make any kind of an impact in our world today? The overall idea here in this psalm is that David was facing a severe test. Maybe it was from Saul. I'm not sure exactly the setting. But his friends are advising him to flee, just get away. Seems hopeless in this situation. But he apparently refused their counsel because he knew there was a God in heaven. He knew that God was seeing what was going on. He chose instead to put his trust in God through it all, no matter what Saul would bring, or maybe it was some other enemy, but it seemed like possibly it was Saul. There's some thought, at least, that it might have been Saul coming after him. And as bad as the situation seemed, God still had a plan that was going to be accomplished. He is in control. He was in control for David. He's in control today. And so let me just touch on a few things here this morning that, we recognize there's some negatives, there's some real challenges, and yet in the midst of it all, don't forget verse 4. When we begin to question, and here are some of the reasons why. We're plagued by crumbling foundations. You can see that in verse number 3, the first part there, if the foundations be destroyed. All those things that we feel like we've been established on, whether as a nation or maybe even in our homes or churches. We can see it. There's crumbling foundations all around. Obviously, in our country, that's happening. We're right here at a critical time, just a couple of days from election. And in our country, we wonder about the crumbling foundations of freedom, various freedoms that we maybe would question. Well, can I still say what I think, what I feel? Can we still preach? Can we still assemble together and preach something that maybe the world doesn't agree with, but because the Bible says that we preach it? Can we still do that? Morality has just been turned on its head. There's one story after another of all of the decaying foundation of morality. Again, even justice. And you have this court decision, and then maybe it gets appealed, and maybe even various courts will agree with that, and yet you say, that's not what we were founded upon. And you wonder, well, what about our country in the midst of crumbling foundations? Sometimes it might even happen in the church. Not just in our country, but our church sometimes seems like it's sort of had crumbled foundations in the areas of purity and truth. Maybe it's even in the area of what we consider biblical standards. And this is the way God expects us to behave ourselves and look and appear in a wicked world. Areas of morality and how would I want to even say, just modesty, I guess. There's all these sorts of things, and we look at the church around us, and so often in these days, it's like there's very little difference between the church here and the world here, and you're wondering, how does this work? We see the crumbling foundations. Some of those that have had a wonderfully godly background, established in holiness and truth. And then today we'll just allow anything to go. And splits and splinters, and this one won't agree to this new standard of morality or new standard of truth, so to speak. And so they splinter and go off here. We can go on in that. The point is, our churches have had crumbling foundations as well. Sometimes it's maybe even in the character of God's people, well, what we would consider God's people. In us. Crumbling foundations in our character. Sometimes we maybe get the idea that I am not the person that I'm living right now. Now, that might sound like an oxymoron. How can that even be? But the point is, in our head, we say, oh, I still serve God. I'm still a Christian. I still do what God wants me to do. But when it really comes down to it, am I living that way? What about my devotions daily? What about my obedience to what God expects of me? What about my love for my brother, my sister, my love for God? The crumbling foundations. We are plagued in these days by crumbling foundations. I don't think that we can necessarily completely just kind of throw those things away. It's not like we can just put blinders on and well, no, everything's good. Now, I don't think we ought to be a Chicken Little and the sky's always falling and it's always bad and everything's going terribly. But we do need to recognize just the simple fact, the honest fact of the matter, is that we are plagued by crumbling foundations all around us. I don't think that David could have looked at those around him and said, oh, no, everything's good. It's all fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's great. No, he couldn't have said that honestly. And yet he chose to go a little bit further. And yet just before we get to that, let me touch on one other issue. Because not just do we notice the plague of crumbling foundations, and there is, honestly, there is plenty of signs of that happening. But too often we are poisoned then by chronic fretting. And it seems that we've developed a fatalistic mindset, and it's one of the places that I pastored through the years. It was actually maybe a couple of different places. The little phrase I heard over and over in visiting was, what will be, will be. Maybe you've used those words. Nowadays, it's more like, well, it is what it is. I've heard that numbers of times. But sometimes that becomes a fatalistic mindset. And, well, there's nothing I can do about it, I guess. I just have to let it go. And there's a measure of that maybe would seem like, well, okay, that's, I'm just surrendered to whatever happens. But that's too often not really the way this works. But instead, it's just, it's almost like the ball's rolling and I can't stop it, and so I'll get crushed by it eventually or whatever. But the idea maybe sometimes we just have to somehow hold on until Jesus comes back. Even if you look at this passage, if you were just to read this psalm, now I know I've already kind of alluded to the other side of the story, but if you were just to read this on your own privately somewhere, and you read down through this psalm, where would you stop for a few moments of consideration? Many of us probably would stop at verse number 3 and say, yeah, the foundations really are crumbling. What are we going to do? How can we make it any different? That's the way we might often look at it. We may often feel that way, maybe even in the election. But if you look at the passage, it was apparently wrong counsel. David resisted it. David rejected it. Let me just pause for a moment to just look at some of the potential results of chronic fretting, because we often get into that trap. It's almost like it's a step-by-step downward, maybe could I say it that way. And you start out where, because of the appearance, the foundations seem to be destroyed or be crumbling and it's being destroyed, and so we're discouraged. And we get downhearted and depressed. And then when we get discouraged, then before very long, when we get discontent, and it kind of eats at us a little bit, And it's not just that I'm feeling discouraged in the moment, but now I'm getting discontent maybe with what God's doing in my life or what my situation is or how things ought to be different and better. Sometimes, even when you begin getting that far, you can even get veering over into what we might call disobedience because I'm not turning these things over to God. Or maybe even I've just kind of given up that God cares. And so I'm just going to kind of, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die type of thing. If we continue down that course of chronic fretting until we don't trust God like we ought to, we end up in some measure, at least, in disgrace. Now, I'm not saying that you're just going out into deep sin and you're just a disgrace to the church. But what I do think we need to be careful about is the world is watching us. And if we don't trust God and we allow discouragement to lead to discontent, to disobedience, we disgrace the name of God, that people are looking at us for answers. We don't have anything to give them. As we kind of turn the corner here, let me give you a little story. Sir Wilfrid Grenfell, he was a medical missionary up in Canada there, in Labrador. And maybe this will kind of help us to turn the corner. We'll look at verse 4 here in just a little bit. But one day he was out, of course, up there. There was lots of snow and ice. He used a dog team, I think, to some extent, kind of getting around to the different communities. And one particular time, he found himself adrift on an ice floe. It almost seemed, I might have the story wrong, but it almost seemed like he was trying to take a little bit of a shortcut, and the ice was not safe, and he got on this ice floe and couldn't get off. And he had his dogs there, of course, with him. Well, knowing that it was rather bleak, I mean, to human mind, it would have been rather bleak. But he mercifully killed his dogs. I know that's, doesn't even sound nice to us maybe, but he figured, I guess, a couple of things. One is that their skins maybe could help him survive, but also there's no need for them to just die of the cold and exposure. And so he killed the dogs. He made a coat out of their skins to try to protect himself somewhat. I'm not sure exactly now what it was, but somehow he found a way. Maybe it was even the carcass, somehow the bones or something of the dog. He was able to prop up in such a way that he put up a distress flag. And then he laid down beside it and slept. Now that sounds a little bit extreme to us. But later on, the way he gave his testimony, he said, there was nothing to fear. I had done all I could. The rest lay in God's hands. And of course, for him to be able to give the story, we know he was rescued. But can we do that? We chronically fret and wring our hands and wonder, well, Lord, what are you going to do? But there are times that we perhaps ought to just say, Lord, I've done all I know to do. I'm putting it in your hands. Now it's up to you. And I refuse to take it back. And that brings us to the third point I want to make to you today. We are promoted by courageous faith. Yes, the naysayers around David were saying, what are you going to do? It doesn't matter that you're righteous. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and you might as well just run away. But David says, no, I know that the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids try the children of men. And then let's go back to verse number 1 as well, because he says, in the Lord put I my trust. And so this morning, don't forget the need for courageous faith. Oh, it's easy to look at the crumbling foundations. It's easy to chronically fret and worry about the situation. But we have to have courageous faith. When we do, we are defended. Defended from the onslaught of the enemy. Defended from the discouragement and really the debilitation that happens from discouragement, depression. When those things come in, our lives are thrown into turmoil. We don't even necessarily remain healthy because of the turmoil, but we are defended from those things when we put our trust in God. We are also, secondly, delighted. We can be delighted to know what God's doing. Look at what he's doing here. Look at the good things there, and look how God comes through. Sometimes I'm afraid that maybe we, and this is probably a good time to talk about this as well, here at Thanksgiving time, but we fail to even notice the good things because we're so discouraged with what we see or perceive as bad things. But God wants to delight us with His will, His blessing, His intervention in our behalf. He wants to delight us. When we courageously trust in Him, we are defended and we are delighted. But then there's another thing that I would like to just kind of notice with you. This is a little bit of a different twist on it, but we are also desired. We are desired. Notice in verse number 7, he says, "For the righteous Lord loveth righteousness. His countenance doth behold the upright." He's watching us. He's got His eye on us. I think it was the stuttering preacher, August Lelf, years ago. I believe he was the one that said about how God keeps us in the hollow of His hand, so to speak, and every once in a while He takes a peek at us and just makes sure everything's going okay. His eyes are on us. He knows what we need. He knows about this election. He knows what you're facing this week. He knows about that physical, maybe a diagnosis or the prognosis. He knows all about that situation that you're struggling with. You've been praying and praying and praying. Could I just tell you today, when we feel so discouraged or despondent about the things around us, don't forget that we are defended and delighted and desired by God. He helps us to find strength and blessing. Honestly, if you and I would care to, we could probably find plenty of things to fret about. Again, we don't have to put our head in the sand. We don't have to just somehow have rose-colored glasses on or whatever other example you want to use. We recognize there are some bad things. But instead of cursing the darkness, let's light a candle. Let's put our trust in God. Instead of somehow running into the bed and covering our head. Sometimes I felt that way before. Felt like just going to bed for a while, just cover my head and try to forget the problems. But instead of bemoaning the corruption, let's be the salt that cleanses it. Let's be the one that shines a light in the darkness. So we come back to the question. Maybe it was the naysayer saying, what can the righteous do in the sense of hopelessness? But let me give that question to you again. What can the righteous do? Well, they can be an instrument of transformation in God's hands. They can make a difference. The righteous can keep praying. The righteous can keep praising. The righteous can keep pulling on heaven until God comes through. There's plenty for the righteous to do if we'll somehow get our minds off of the fretting and discouragement and the crumbling foundations around us. Pray about them. The outlook can still be bright when we claim verse 1 and verse number 4 as our own. I choose to trust the God who's got His eyes on me. Can we do that this morning? God is still in His temple. He is still on His throne, and His eyes are still on us. Praise God. We don't have to just wring our hands in despair, but we can have confidence in trusting God with a courageous faith in the midst of the trials and the difficulties we face. Praise His name.